Hello, again this is Dr. Jimmy, of course. Who else would be here lurking in the dark wearing a Panama hat? And somewhere lurking is a Panama cat. Maybe, I don't know. She's not Panama, she's Japanese. She's a Japanese bobtail. That's the very clever original name, Bob. Not much, alright. Bobtail Bob, it was rather easy, but she likes it, she answers to it, so there you go. Actually, she left the room, I don't know where she is. This is still the same day, so I'm wearing the same damn shirt I was wearing the last video, so I'm not going to show it to you again! There! So what? But, this is part 9 of my history of Halloween Horror Nights 21. In the previous video, I had just started talking about the house Souls in Steam into the machine, but we hadn't actually gotten into the machine yet. We'd only just gotten to the first room of the house, which was all that thing about the horizon. But as I said, the horizon is a lie. There's no city of tomorrow waiting, no great big wonderful tomorrow, no, none of that. Nope. You're actually being lured, you volunteers, you're all these nice young fit people, because your bodies are full of moisture. You're being lured into the house so that they can process your young flesh, removing every trace of moisture, so they can run the machines with the steam from your blood. Of course, this will make you unable to live in any city of the future, present or past, because you'll be dead! Yes. Nasty, killed in nasty ways. And that's what you find out, because as you go through and see the city, oh how pretty, how lovely, we're going to go volunteer to be a part of the horizon, then you enter the next room and into the machine. You hear that, and there it is. Great big horrid machine filled with gears and great big pointy nasty saws buzzing down, twirling from the ceiling, coming towards you. All of this, and some bastard dressed up in steampunk smock or apron with his little goggles, all sweaty because he works in the factory of death, throwing his victim into the very teeth of the machine, clank, 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 tearing flesh and blood and bone, ripping it out, entrails, gore, everything, torn to bits. You see this happening in front of you, and of course you're next to go in the machine, but you keep going and you go through more corridors, all done with a nifty steampunk architecture, and you see how the bodies are being processed, how the bits and pieces are being ripped apart and pressed, and it's like going to one of those aquariums. They have all sorts of windows in the wall, and you can see different kind of fish swimming about. Except here, you can, in the windows, you see the machines and what they're doing. And there's lots of, some of them are filled with water because it's like the water's being extracted. So you have eyeballs and bits and pieces floating. As then it's compressed, big presses squishing out all the body parts, getting every last drop out, and the water of course goes through pipes to where it's collected. How nice. And of course you have your scare actors in their steampunk gear, some of them with chainsaws, some with other weapons, coming after you so that you goes in the machine too, so that you too can be processed. One neat scene above you, there was a walkway, and there was a fellow up there in black leather with one of those, some kind of gadget that he could run along some chain link, and when that happened, all kinds of sparks, electrical shit, sparks come raining down on top of you. Oh my, electricity, how shocking. And then, one of the more, I mentioned a video game called BioShock. A lot of the aesthetic of this also borrowed not just from Disney, but from the video game BioShock, which in turn, to be fair, also borrows a bit from the whole Walt Disney utopian thing. Because the character there, I forget the name, but he's a visionary, similar to Walt himself, who created the city of Rapture beneath the sea. And it's a very similar concept, but you see there were some suits and scenes and designs that looked like it came right out of the video game. They didn't have the creepy little girl and the big daddy, but they did have, you know, some of the designs that looked right like it. There's one scene in particular, you go down a corridor and there's what looks like a waterfall going in front of you, and behind it's a guy in a sort of body suit, kind of underwater type of suit, steampunk looking thing, rather interesting, and then he comes out from the water coming out from behind. Very, very neat special effect. All of this. You'd think the people of New Yorkshire wouldn't be wasting that water. They need it for, oh well. But fun, exciting house. And of course, at the end of it, there's always some bastard with a chainsaw to chase you out, as often happened in the exit queues of the houses in this location and some of the others. So that was it. A rather nifty little, very atmospheric house, clever theme. I liked it. Wasn't my favourite that year, but it was a good house, and it was the last house ever in that iconic location, the Jaws queue. So we must now, this is why I wear the hat, I have bad hair days, and so we must now mourn the Jaws queue. Goodbye, Jaws queue. And as I said, that would cause problems in succeeding years, or especially the very next year, for finding a place to stick a house after the Jaws queue was gone. But we'll get to that when we get to Halloween Horror Nights 22. We'll never get there if I don't finish 21, will we? So, next house. Well, the next house... oh, wait a minute. Of course. That was the year I did the cocktails, and for that house, I wanted a cocktail that would be steaming, because it's Souls and Steam. So that was the first hot cocktail I devised. At Finnegan's Bar and Grill, I had them make this for me. I thought that would be a good cocktail. You get a look at it there. That was my Souls and Steam cocktail. I didn't want to use coffee as the base. I thought tea would be better. Steampunk, of course, is related to the whole tweed and brass and leather chap culture, you know, big mustachios and things. That fits in with steampunk to a certain way. And there's a fellow in a sort of chap rap subgenre called Professor Elemental, and he has a lovely song called Cup of Brown Joy. He raps about the ecstasy of drinking tea at tea time. There he is. I suggest you check it out. It's quite funny to see, you know, this sort of very British upper class type fellow dressed that way, rapping about anything, especially rapping about tea and about tweed and about that sort of stuff. So I thought that would be funny to make it tea-based, and what would go the spirit be, would be best for it, then gin, of course. And you can get more steampunk than gin and tonic or something like that. So I put the gin and the tea, and I had some lemon to you know, make it like a sort of a strong tea, and then added a shot of bitters, just a little bit of bitters for that. However, I have to confess, I probably should have put some sugar or something else in it. It came out not quite as good as I'd hoped. Of all the cocktails I made that year, that was not so good. So I wouldn't recommend trying it. Some of the other cocktails are quite delicious, but that one wasn't. Oh well, that was the Souls and Steam cocktail. So let's move on to the next house. The next house was in Parade Building, or Building 79. A building which, of course, was used as a warehouse to house the parade floats. So every year in February and March, and well, going all the way almost to June sometimes, in April, May, or at least to April, sometimes even longer, is this wonderful thing they've been doing at Universal for quite some time called Mardi Gras. Oh yes, well past the real Mardi Gras season in New Orleans, but well, it's fun. And so they have a lot of floats they use for Mardi Gras, and those were stored during the other part of the year when it's not Mardi Gras time, stored in this great warehouse, Building 79. You see. And they decided that they could take all those floats out of the warehouse and put them into a temporary structure that was across from it, sort of what they called the parade gazebo, wrap them up in plastic. In 2010 they actually took a float and put it in the scare zone. So, and then you'd have the building would be empty, and you could use that whole building for haunted houses. And so there were some really nifty haunted houses. I remember, of course, that was Scary Tales was there. It was, I think, the first one. And then in 2009 they had the Silver Screams, the Universal Palace Theatre was in there, and then the year before was the Hallowed Past. So they could put some pretty large houses in there, utilizing that space. and it's a tall ceilinged room, and so they could go up quite a bit too if they wanted to. In fact, in my silly April Fool's gag that I did in 2011, I suggested that the house in that room would fill up the whole place. Of course, I thought it was going to be, I didn't think it, but I was just, in my joke, I chose an Edgar Allan Poe themed house. Turned out there was one in a different location, but that they could build a huge palace in there, like, and as it turned out, they did in fact create a really elaborate house that went up to the ceiling practically, and filled that whole space, and it was quite elaborate. So in a way I presaged that, although it was only a joke. I had no idea what they were doing in there at all. And what was interesting though about that, or not interesting, but sort of, again, a bit of nostalgia, a bit of poignancy, is that that was the last time they could really do that in recent years, because the following year there'd be a new parade daily in the parks, and there'd be new things to store, and they couldn't empty the whole warehouse every year for Halloween Horror Nights, and so they would reduce the amount of space they could use in the parade building after that. And this was the last time though that you were able to go in the front door rather than go around back. And so this house was called the Forsaken, and it had a sort of nautical theme. Not a naughty theme, a nautical theme. Indeed, it had a rather intriguing backstory. The backstory was that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We all know that from grade school, where it taught that as children, that how Christopher Columbus, an Italian, went to the court of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain, which had become a country when the two of them got married, and combining their kingdoms into one called Spain, España, and talked about how, you know, these other countries, especially the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Portuguese, were always at odds with each other because the Spaniards thought Portugal should be a part of Spain, and the Portuguese wanted to remain independent, and sometimes they actually conquered it, and sometimes you know, they eventually get their independence back in wars and stuff. So there was always that, and they were able to navigate all the way around the world to get to the Indies, where that is off in Indonesia, and other places in the Atlantic Ocean over in Asia, where they could get all kinds of neat spices and things that and silks and gold, worth lots of money. And so Columbus had a bright idea, because they figured the world was round, but he didn't realize the world was a little bit bigger than he thought it was. But he thought, let's sail, but we can't go the other way because the Portuguese are very, very, very protective and will attack you if you try to sail their trade routes. But let's take a different trade route and sail west, and we'll just go around the Atlantic to the other side of the world, and we'll get to Asia that way. Ha ha! And the Queen and King of Spain thought that was an excellent idea, and they financed him and gave him 3 ships, the Pinta, the Nina, and the Santa Maria. Except, according to this haunted house, there were 4 ships. The Pinta, the Nina, the Santa Maria, that we've all heard about, but a 4th ship, which was called the Philippa Moniz, or is that Philippa Moniz, if you're speaking Castilian? Yes. So, on the Philippa Moniz, there were 4 ships sailing, actually, going on their way west into the Atlantic, hoping to reach the Asiatic islands of Indonesia, the Indies, where they could get all that loot. But, of course, Columbus didn't realize the world was a little bit bigger than he thought it was, and the ocean on the other side of Asia wasn't the Atlantic at all. It was a completely different ocean called the Pacific, which was enormous, bigger than the Atlantic. And then in between the Pacific and the Atlantic were 2 freaking continents, North and South America. In fact, I'm sitting on one of those continents right now. Wow. Florida. Florida's not a continent, but it sticks out from one like a penis. Anyway, so I'm sitting here on Florida, and Columbus didn't get here because he ran into, of course, the islands of what we call the West Indies, because he thought he hit the Indies and he didn't. And it turns out to be a different island, the Caribbean islands. He actually landed on the island we now call Hispaniola. He named it that because he came from Spain, or actually his ships did. And it's today actually two countries on one island. One half of it is Haiti, and the other half is the Dominican Republic, you see. That was the island he landed on. And all those other islands in that area, he thought he had landed in Indonesia, and he thought the mainland was China or someplace, and he could come back another time and get more, go to see the great emperor of China and get all kinds of stuff and trade with silk and stuff, and no good for the queen, except when he got there, he couldn't find a lot of spices. There were some peppers. They did eat that in the New World. But where's all the gold? Where's the silk? And why are these people naked? Well, not naked, but naked to Spanish thinking, you know, wearing, you know, barbarians. They weren't what he was expecting. Now, according to the backstory, and this is based partially on truth, while they were trying to get there, they had to go through the Atlantic, had terrible storms, and there were also, of course, some nasty places, including the Bermuda Triangle, yes, but they didn't call it that then, because they didn't know it was called Bermuda. But in that area of the sea where weird shit is known to happen, they went through the Sargasso Sea, and that kind of, that could stop up your ship and it might not even move, or there were periods of time when there was no storm, no wind, nothing, and you can't even move because you have sails and your sails go, you know, no wind, you can't move. And a lot of the sailors were saying, we're going to die out here, you're fucking crazy, Columbus, thinking you're going to get to Indonesia by going west, we're going to die out here and it's all your fault, we're going to mutiny. They didn't though. He managed to put down any mutinies, and the three ships eventually did get to the New World. Except according to this story, the backstory for this, and there's an urban myth that there was a fourth ship that was lost. Or is it a suburban myth, or I don't know what kind of, some kind of myth. And so this was the Philippa Moniz, and the captain of that ship was Antonio Cabot. And Antonio Cabot and his crewmen, they were going to mutiny, and they're trying to get letters to the other ships because they thought they were never going to make it out of there alive and go back to fucking Spain where it was safe, and they could go back to what seamen always like doing, drinking rum and carousing and all that sort of thing, you know, and have some sex with someone prettier than the cabin boy, and all of that was going on, you know, looking over the sea and mistaking a manatee for a mermaid because they had that much rum. Yes, and while they were doing that, trying to get out of it, Columbus decided to screw them, and he took his three ships and abandoned them after they tried to mutiny and left them adrift, basically. I don't know what he did, keelhauled them or something, you know, disabled the ship somehow. He abandoned them, and they were left in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and they couldn't go back, they couldn't go forward, they were lost in the Bermuda Triangle. Oh dear, they were lost there, the ship was lost, and they sank and they all drowned or something. Well, then what happens? Well, a few hundred years later, but not to present day, but a couple hundred years later, of course, the Spaniards had succeeded in colonizing much of parts of America, especially South America, but they had a good colony here in Florida. You remember, you've heard of St. Augustine and other places like that, and they set up little Spanish forts and that sort of thing in the Caribbean. And apparently, at one of these forts, which might be on a Caribbean island or might even be here on the coast of Florida, somewhere there in a Spanish settlement, a ship appears on the horizon during a stormy night. It is the Philippa Moniz, and it's returning from its watery grave, seeking vengeance. Of course, all the people who screwed them have been dead for centuries, but they don't give a fuck. They're going to seek vengeance on any Spanish settlements they can find in the New World. And they arrive and crash into the fort and begin the campaign of merciless slaughter of the Spanish troops and anyone else who's in that fort. And that's the story of the Forsaken. Very elaborate, very beautiful, and indeed the house itself was elaborate and beautiful. As I said, they filled the whole bloody Parade Building 79 with this magnificent house, which also evoked a Disney attraction, one of the most popular attractions, the Pirates of the Caribbean. Just like when you go through the queue and you're going through the Spanish Fort. Of course, I don't know what it's like nowadays. I've not gone on it since they started putting Captain Jack Sparrow and retconning it for the movies. But I remember the classic attraction from the old days. And you go through the Spanish Fort in the queue inside there until you finally get to the boats, and you go through the whole, you know, you've ridden the ride, I hope. So, yeah, it evokes a lot of that. In fact, earlier in the year, when we started to hear things, was something going on, a friend of mine saw a cart filled with very obvious sea-like props, you know, sails and masts and those big ship wheels and that kind of stuff, and things that looked like they came out of a pirate movie. That kind of stuff was going into the parade building. He said, "We're going to have a pirate house." And that's what we were thinking. Oh, a pirate house. Ooh. Wasn't exactly right. They had ships and stuff, but it wasn't pirates. It was something else. Alright, and I've already reached my capacity, so I have to continue The Forsaken in part 10.